Hello and welcome everyone to the 11th episode in the new iteration of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. My name is Robius, and I'm pleased to present to you the first in a sub-series of these episodes. Although I normally cover the history of individuals depicted in the Assassin's Creed franchise, and then compare them to the historical source material that inspired their portrayal, this marks the beginning of a slight alteration in that project. For the next few videos, I intend on chronologically covering the time periods used for the various Assassin's Creed games, touching on the major historical points included, while also filling in the gaps and introducing you to the figures in the game who actually existed. I feel as though this should be an interesting, albeit complicated undertaking, but I'm looking forward to sharing it with you all. With all of that in mind, in today's episode, we'll start at the beginning of the franchise by evaluating the history behind the Third Crusade. Please be aware of potential story spoilers throughout the video. For the sake of clarifying and establishing a better understanding of the Third Crusade's origins, I'm going to provide you with some additional background information to the events that preceded the first AC title. At its core, the concept of crusading was the act of waging a holy war, in the name of the Latin Church, for a series of set goals against certain religion-based adversaries. For this video, we'll solely be discussing the context behind the Crusades in the Levant. These were a grouping of expeditions with the goal of initially reclaiming important cities in the name of Christianity, establishing safe passage for Christian pilgrims, while fundamentally installing and maintaining European military and economic control in a region they had lost years ago. Therefore, although the Crusades technically spanned from the 11th to the 16th century, we'll only be concentrating on the events occurring from 1189 to 1192. Now that we've covered the basic concept of crusading, I'm going to provide you with a quick recap of what led to the Third Crusade. Evidently, European military involvement in the Holy Land recommenced with the launching of the First Crusade in 1095, in which a joint coalition of Christian nations spent approximately 4 years fighting and negotiating their way through ranks of multiple independent Islamic factions, leading to a resounding victory in 1099. This success led the Church to once again lay claim to Jerusalem, thus establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states, which would remain their seats of power in the region. Although the Europeans experienced a period of expansion in the Levant, further consolidating the size and control of their Crusader states, they were soon challenged by united Muslim forces. These more organized adversaries proved difficult to fight, leading to the 1144 fall of their first Crusader state, the County of Edessa. This in turn led to the call for a second crusade in 1147, which only lasted 2 years and ultimately ended in failure when it was unsuccessful in re-establishing their control. At this point, the son of Edessa's conqueror, Nur ad-Din, became the leader of a unified Syria. Over the following years, both through political negotiations and military expeditions, he would essentially come to control most of Egypt. By 1174, however, both Nur ad-Din and his most trusted general had passed away from illness. This made way for Salah ad-Din to initially take control of Egypt and begin the extended process of unifying its forces with those of Syria, a goal he eventually achieved. In his new role as Sultan, he represented an Islamic threat to the Crusader states, in the form of his new Ayyubid dynasty, the likes of which had not yet been faced. It is said that Salah ad-Din's wide empire was well chronicled by the geographer Ibn Jubayr, during his travels that immediately preceded the start of the Third Crusade. During this period of Islamic unification, the Kingdom of Jerusalem experienced its own shifts in leadership, eventually reaching the reign of King Guy of Lusignan. Guy's rule represented one of the most divisive periods among the leadership of the remaining Crusader states and included increasing aggression with the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Consequently, Guy was soon put in a difficult position when Salah ad-Din's forces circled his kingdom and besieged certain cities, leading the king to muster his forces and respond. Unfortunately, his adversary manipulated him into marching his men through the desert, leaving them exhausted, thirsty, and easy targets for their Ayyubid enemies. Salah ad-Din's superior forces crushed Guy's army at the Battle of Hattin, the king was subsequently imprisoned and later ransomed, and the majority of the Crusader army in the Levant collapsed. Among those captured in the aftermath of the Battle of Hattin was William V, Marquess of Montferrat, a Crusader who was eventually released the next year. In the coming months, the Sultan captured both Jerusalem and Acre, thus putting a significant strain on the European presence in the region. In response to these developments, Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade. England and France, who had been at war with each other, agreed on peace terms so that they could crusade together, leading both countries to begin preparations. Around the same time, in light of the coming war and his intent to conquer further territory, in 1188 Salah ad-Din enlisted Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad as his chronicler. In this position, he would be an eyewitness to the events of the later Siege of Acre and the Battle of Arsuf, giving him first-hand experience from which to write. For this accurate work, he would eventually be promoted to the role of city administrator. Back in Europe, although not the first ruler to officially answer the call of the Third Crusade, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa quickly amassed a large army. With Hungarian support, his German forces were the earliest to begin their march to the Holy Land, opting out of a naval departure. Depending on your perspective, this may mark the beginning of the Crusade. Unfortunately, upon their arrival in Byzantine territory, the Germans were slowed down due to the interference of the Byzantine emperor who'd sided with Salah ad-Din. Meanwhile, in Europe, the newly crowned King Richard I of England had been amassing his own troops and funds alongside his now ally King Philip II of France. By April of 1190, the English fleet was launched and set to meet up with the remaining forces before heading to the Holy Land. Unfortunately, within just a few months of the other European forces commencing their voyages to the Levant, the elder Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, after bypassing the Byzantine delays and fighting off Seljuk resistance to his advances, suddenly fell off his horse while crossing a river and drowned. Nonetheless, after they continued facing off against many attacks on behalf of the local Islamic factions, and without a clear leader, much of the German army either routed or returned home to await the appointment of their new ruler. A small faction of the original Crusaders, thought to have numbered around 5,000, remained in the Holy Land under the command of Frederick of Swabia, son of the emperor. They reached the Principality of Antioch, but lost even more of their men due to illness, although they did eventually join the siege in Acre. Notably, among the remaining Crusaders was Meister Seibrand, who is credited as later operating a temporary hospital during the siege of Acre and eventually opening a full hospital once the city was taken by the Crusaders. This establishment would become the center of power for the Teutonic Knights, of which Seibrand was considered the unofficial first Grand Master. In Europe, King Richard and his forces finally departed in a separate fleet in early August of 1190, with King Philip's troops soon following a few weeks later. Their armies briefly met in Sicily and had a dispute with its king. Ultimately, Philip and the French left Sicily, reached the Holy Land via the Crusader-held city of Tyre, and proceeded onwards to Acre in April of 1191, where they joined the siege that had been started nearly 2 years earlier by the former king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan. Before joining the Crusader efforts, Richard briefly stopped at Cyprus, and when hostilities erupted with its ruler, he conquered the island. The English king finally joined the siege of Acre in early June of 1191, with Rabat de Sablé being among his commanders. Together, the English and the French provided their support in the form of building additional siege engines, which proved an integral component in taking Acre by mid-July. Although this proved to be a major Crusader victory, the immediate aftermath was filled with internal strife between the Europeans, both in terms of dividing the captured wealth and in terms of who they desired as the king of Jerusalem. Richard's support ensured that Guy would maintain the title until his death, despite the protests of the French king and Austrian duke who supported Conrad of Montferrat for the crown. However, it was agreed that once Guy died, the crown would pass on to Conrad and his family. In this time, King Philip II of France was ill with dysentery, and after this immediate conflict with his supposed allies, he decided to return home to France, much to the displeasure of Richard. However, he did leave behind most of his crusaders and the funds with which to pay them. This would be the point where the plotline of the first Assassin's Creed game takes place, generally believed to be between mid-July of 1191 to September of 1191, which represented a block of downtime between larger events of the Third Crusade. After the siege, it is said that there were initial communications between Richard and Salah ad-Din. The Sultan attempted to negotiate the release of his captured garrisons. However, it is said that Richard felt the Ayyubid leader continued to purposefully delay the proceedings to impact the crusade, and therefore he responded by having all of these prisoners executed in view of Salah ad-Din's army. This was met by a Saracen response in which all of their Christian prisoners were also executed. This massacre on the Crusader side was presented as the doing of William de Montferrat in the game rather than Richard. Thereafter, Richard wished to take Jerusalem, but understood that controlling the port city of Jaffa was necessary before launching such an endeavor. Recognizing what this new Crusader march represented, Salah ad-Din prepared a preemptive counterattack. The Saracen strategy consisted of goading the Crusaders into breaking ranks and attacking by constantly firing arrows at them, but Richard held his forces together, pushing them in a slow march along the coast on their way to Jaffa. Realizing small attacks would not work, the Sultan prepared his troops for a large-scale engagement in the forested, marshy region of Arsuf. Richard's forces camped the night before the battle on September 6, 1191. In the game, this is where Altair came to meet him, fought through Saracen and Crusader forces, and eventually faced off against Rabat de Sablé. Evidently, in history, there was clearly no talk of a potential alliance between the Crusader and Saracen factions against the Assassin Order, with whom Salah ad-Din was actually on good terms with at the time. From this point onward, we'll be discussing the history of the Third Crusade after the events of the first AC game. Historically speaking, identifying that they may be ambushed, Richard reorganized his army, with the Templars under the command of Rabat de Sablé leading the front, and the rearguard being defended by the Knights Hospitaller, who were led by Garnier de Nablus. The Saracens continued to launch small-scale attacks, which Richard did not want to pursue in fear of breaking ranks. In the end, when he declined their requests to counterattack, the Hospitallers disobeyed orders, broke ranks, and charged Salah ad-Din's troops, forcing Richard to commit to a full-scale attack in which he could re-coordinate his forces. Ultimately, this surprisingly fast strike led to an overwhelming Crusader victory, thus boosting their morale and proving that Salah ad-Din was in fact not an invincible commander. The Crusaders then took Jaffa, and although negotiations were reopened with the Sultan, these quickly fell apart. Consequently, by November, Richard marched to within a few miles of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, when severe weather suddenly struck, the Crusaders made the difficult decision to pull back to their coastal position instead of risking a battle with an unknown force and possibly getting trapped and besieged in the city if they took it. Within the Crusader camp, tensions rose as Richard the Lionheart and Conrad of Montferrat developed a bitter rivalry, which finally came to head when the kingdom's nobles took a vote and decided that Conrad and not Guy of Lusignan would be king of Jerusalem, a verdict that Richard had to accept. However, prior to his official coronation, Conrad of Montferrat was killed by a pair of assassins thought to have been sent by Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the Syrian leader of their order. It is unknown if this was done at the behest of Richard, Salah ad-Din, or simply for the agenda of the Old Man of the Mountain himself. In response to this sudden death, Henry II of Champagne was married to Queen Isabella, the apparent inheritor of the crown, thus making him the new ruler of Jerusalem. After more failed negotiations, the Crusaders occupied a few key positions around Jerusalem, and by June they were ready to strike. However, the joint venture's leaders reached a disagreement. Fundamentally, the Crusader forces were divided on how they should take the city, with Richard and his supporters wanting to force Salah ad-Din to surrender it by cutting his supply routes to Egypt, whereas the Duke of Burgundy, who led the French in Philip's stead, demanded a direct assault on the Holy City. With both sides thoroughly split and unwilling to fully commit to one plan, the Crusaders again needed to pull back. Within a month, seizing the advantage provided by this delay, Salah ad-Din succeeded in suddenly capturing Jaffa. Upon hearing of this invasion, Richard prepared a small elite force and led a stealthy attack on Jaffa by sea. They caught the Ayyubids off guard, freed their captured comrades, and pushed the Sultan's forces out of the city. Although Salah ad-Din attempted another attack, it was resisted. This Crusader victory provided Richard the Lionheart with some leverage, which he used in September of 1192 as negotiations were once again opened and finally came to fruition. Although many elements were discussed, the central points of this treaty were that Salah ad-Din would respect the existing Crusader holdings, that they in turn would respect his, and that although Jerusalem would remain within the Sultan's dominion, Christian pilgrims and traders would be allowed to visit the city. With all of these issues settled, Richard began his trip back to Europe on October 9th, 1192, thus signaling the end of the Third Crusade. In conclusion, although both sides benefited from this treaty, they were each disappointed with the end result, as a total victory had been desired. In Western eyes, it was seen as a general success due to the reconstruction of the Crusader states and the fortification of their coastal control. However, the Crusade did fall short of its ultimate objective of retaking Jerusalem. Whereas in Saracen views, although peace was eventually achieved and they did hold the city of Jerusalem, they were strongly disappointed that Salah ad-Din had failed to expel Western influence from the region altogether. Now that we've reached the end of this historic event, we can proceed to the final chapter in the video, where we will review everything that's been learned so far and compare its depiction in the game to the actual history. I'll start by first stating that before analyzing anything, it's important to recognize that although it wasn't blatantly stated in the narrative, the first Assassin's Creed game is generally agreed to have only taken place during a period of a few months at the most. This is noteworthy because it seems that the writers chose this time slot as it represented a general lull in military activities during the Third Crusade. I'm also going to try to not go into detail about every inaccuracy in the game, but rather concentrate on those connected to major events as they relate to the Crusade. Having said that, historically, during Altair's adventures, the political landscape of the playable cities was correct, with the Saracens holding Jerusalem and Damascus while the Crusaders were positioned in Acre. In terms of the blatantly fictionalized elements, the two main ones that come to mind are the sieges of Mastiaf, led by the Crusader forces in 1189 and Templar forces in 1191, as was shown in Revelations and the first AC title. To put it simply, there were no such militarized endeavors in which European forces attacked the assassin stronghold. Next, it can be stated that the assassination targets that weren't discussed in this video were fictionalized individuals and did not play a role in ruling their respective cities. In addition, the final portion of the game which was completely invented was the range of the Templar Order. It can definitely be said that they were not widespread between both sides of the conflict and consequently did not have access to Saracen-held cities as was shown in the game. Now we can move on to the realm where Assassin's Creed excels, which is to say the portions of the game where they alter the history to better fit their narrative. The first point in this category was when the game presented King Richard chastising William de Montferrat for having all of Acre's prisoners executed, when in reality it was the king himself who ordered the massacre. Next, although the Assassin Order did conduct multiple assassinations during the Third Crusade, some of which were high profile, it was not to the extent that was presented in the game. It's also worth mentioning that in most cases, the figures selected as assassination targets in the game weren't killed by the Assassin Order, although many did die within a year or so of their depicted murders for a variety of different reasons. However, I'd like to bring up that although William de Montferrat was not historically assassinated, his son Conrad, the soon-to-be King of Jerusalem, was just a year later. Lastly, the final point I'd like to bring up was the depiction of the prelude in the Battle of Arsuf. Although Richard's forces did set camp in the wooded area, there was clearly no negotiation for establishing a Crusader-Saracen alliance against the assassins, which was interrupted by Altair. In reality, at that time, Salah ad-Din was on reasonable terms with the assassin mentor. Keeping all of this information in mind, let's now talk about whether the Third Crusade was fairly depicted in the Assassin's Creed games. Personally, I think it was a reasonable depiction, which definitely included a series of embellishments and tweaks to the history. On one hand, the game exaggerates the presence and influence of both the Templar and Assassin orders, however, this is somewhat understandable because it's the central point of the fictional narrative. On the other hand, the game really sets a great atmosphere. I personally liked how the orators in each city spin their own explanation of the current events, as the Christians celebrate the acquisition of Acre and feel that they are retaking their Crusader states, whereas their Muslim counterparts warn of the European invaders and cheer on the efforts of Salah ad-Din, who rises against the threat presented by King Richard. Overall, although the game simplifies certain portions of this military campaign, given the short time period in which it occurs, I still found its depiction of this brief, transitional period within the Third Crusade to be particularly interesting. And with that final point, we've reached the end of today's video. If you enjoyed the content, please share this series with your friends and be sure to watch our other episodes. Although I have a current plan for the next few videos, feel free to leave any topic requests in the comments. My sources for making this video will be in the description bar below. Thanks for watching.